Hi, it's Andy from PCR Global with a video from our A to Z of risk management playlist. These videos are short enough not to induce boredom, but important enough to keep at the front of our minds and the tips of our tongues as we stand on the front line of safety. Today's letter is D and the subject is dynamic risk assessment.
So, dynamic risk assessment. Is there any such thing as a dynamic risk assessment, or is it just a risk assessment? We're just going to use some PCR slides here just to have a look at risk assessment anyway. So, the law, what do we need to know? A quick overview of the legislative framework in the UK. At least we have the Health and Safety at Work Act that sits at the top. This is the filing cabinet. Underneath that we have regulations. Underneath those we can have approved codes of practice depending on what the regulation is. We also have a raft of health and safety guidance, which we'll have a look at in a minute, and also industry guidance depending on what the hazard circumstance scenario is. And then we have the criminal law, which we're talking about, which is the Health and Safety Work Act and the regulations. It's criminal law, so we can get prosecuted. Within all of these regulations sits the requirement for risk assessment. Within those regulations, I can't find it. Please let me know if you can. I can't find the term dynamic risk assessment. We can find model somewhere, but certainly not dynamic. The Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. This is the main one that we go for, Regulation 3, when it talks about suitable and sufficient risk assessment. It doesn't mention anything about dynamic risk assessment. The Control of Vibration at Work Regulations also requires risk assessment, as do all of these. So, control of asbestos regulations, the manual handling operations regulations, the control of noise at work regulations, the display screen equipment regulations, the PPE regulations, the regulatory form fire safety order, DSEA, the dangerous substances and explosive atmosphere regulations. They require risk assessment. The control of substances hazardous to health regulations 2002 require risk assessment, as does the control of lead at work regulations and the ionizing radiation regulations. So there's a number of regulations there that require risk assessment. It's not just Regulation 3. So the Health and Safety at Work Act is the primary health and safety legislation in the UK, which sets out the responsibilities of employers and employees as well as others. The Act, as we've just said, gives powers to the Health and Safety Executive to enforce health and safety law. So it is criminal law. So if it gives powers to the Health and Safety Executive, then that's a little bit of an indication here. We're going to be talking about that in a little bit of time, so we can take some guidance from them, of course. Now, thinking about risk assessment and thinking about dynamic risk assessment, let's just look at this. £1.1 million fine after workers' severe blood loss in a fall. Now, what I want us to think about is the written risk assessment before the event compared to a dynamic risk assessment. A London-based refurbishment company has been fined after a worker was seriously injured when he fell from height from a ladder. Fallen from a ladder, really common. Unfortunately, Luton Crown Court heard that on the 5th of September an engineer was testing a sprinkler system for leaks at a site in Hemel Hempstead. He climbed onto an internal roof and was inspecting the leak from an extension ladder. The ladder slipped away from him and he fell almost 3 metres into the gap between the internal roof and external wall. Lots of injuries, including fractured vertebrae and soft tissue damage, but also lost a lot of blood. Risk assessment. Now, obviously the company's been fined. There potentially may have been a risk assessment done prior to that. On that day, obviously the equipment was being used and the ladders slid. So there's been nothing there to actually stop the ladder from sliding. I don't know the condition of the ladder. I don't need to know to look into it. What I want us to think about is that dynamic risk assessment. When people talk about these, they talk about a risk assessment done on the fly, on the ground at that time. If we're going to rely on dynamic risk assessments, it shouldn't be a cop-out. Some people do. They rely on it as a cop-out. They don't actually have a written and recorded general or even a task-specific risk assessment. People talk about point of work risk assessments as well, and that's very much a dynamic risk assessment. There are times for dynamic risk assessment which we'll look at In that case there, are we saying the actual employee could have done a dynamic risk assessment? I don't know. Are we saying the actual employee was subject to not working within a safe environment because his equipment wasn't correct? We don't know. Was his training correct? We don't know. But ultimately, at that time, if the individual was trained, there should be knowledge enough to know that the safe system of work that you want to put in, forget whether it's written or not, that it is a safe working option for the individual at that time. I don't want to think about all the other nuances, because there are many, many behavioural nuances involved in this, but I'm on about the dynamism of risk assessing. Consultants will come in, they'll write your risk assessments for you, they'll give them to you, you'll download them offline. If you're downloading risk assessments of people offline, and we've put risk assessment out there, we always say you have to tailor it to your environment. And then think about the dynamic risk assessment as well. So it's leading me into going on and on about training in a minute. Another company ordered to pay more than 125,000. It was another ladder fall. The court heard an employee was using a ladder to inspect a steam leak at height when the ladder failed. So at this time, the ladder has broken. It didn't slide, it's actually failed. So again, at that time, pre-use check. Detailed visual inspections of ladders, but pre-use check. That pre-use check is a risk assessment at that time. And that's what dynamic risk assessing is. It's risk assessing in the here and now. Your risk assessment you may never have seen by anybody. But ultimately, we have to be aware of hazards. Our own personal hazard identification needs to be good. If I go to Iraq, if I go to Somalia, it's a different kettle of fish in certain environments. The guys that I go to see when they're there, they are attuned to that environment. I'm not always attuned to that environment because I don't spend all my time there. So it's very important to think of what does dynamic risk assessments actually mean. I say it means the individuals on the ground are competent in the hazardous environment. We know the emergency services do them, as we're going to cover in a minute. But think of that dynamism. What does it really mean? Okay, moving on. Just something I want to say here, a bit of a word of warning really. Enterprise risk management. I myself really like enterprise risk management. I like ISO 31000. I teach it. I teach corporate risk essentials. But what I've noticed on a course lately is that we have people who are not familiar with the health and safety environment, not familiar with environmental environment, not familiar with the security risk management environment, and they're on an enterprise risk management course where they're putting a matrix together, and the matrix is talking about health and safety as a one-liner. As I said during the course, one or two liners in a risk register will probably not evidence a suitable and sufficient risk assessment was undertaken, especially if it's for the control of vibration at work, control of noise at work, regulatory reform, fire safety order, when all these things are very specific. This is where that specific, specialised, competent individual, whether it's a security individual, an environmental individual, or a health and safety individual, can really make a difference. So please, if you do enterprise risk management and you're very comfortable, that's what you do, please have it in there that where required, have your knowledge that other risk assessments should be getting made as well. The Health and Safety at Work Act. Where else can we look? We can certainly look in the Health and Safety at Work Act. Let's have a look directly in here. General duties of employers. We're not going to find that a dynamic risk assessment can be done. We're not going to find that. But what we are going to find, the provision of such information, instruction, training and supervision as is necessary to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety at work of his employees. The provision of such information, instruction and training. So if we are working in jobs where we may be a peripatetic worker, when we're out on the ground, we may be emergency services, whereby they are dealing with a changing environment. Risk assessments or model risk assessment will not fit that environment, and decisions have to be made on the ground that are going to save lives. If you're a social worker going to somebody's house, how can you write a risk assessment on somebody's house if you've never been there before? So you will have a model style, generic style risk assessment that's been done. You don't fully know the task because the minute you go into that house, you do not know what you're going to be faced with. But then if you've been trained, if you've been given such information, instruction and training, obviously supervision comes into it, but not in a dynamic risk assessment. We're talking about being in that house at that time. You need to be positioning yourself in a certain location. You need to have various drills. When you go in there, take a bottle of water with you. Do you want to drink when you're inside? No, I don't. I've got my own drink. Or my partner's going to be ringing me in 10 minutes. You're going to position yourself near the door. Whatever is decided in that dynamic environment. So what I think the Health and Safety at Work Act is telling us, the provision of such information, instruction and training as is necessary for the role that you're doing. So it can't be a cop-out. So a pure risk assessment for a machine, if you're doing a risk assessment on a machine that's static, this is what we're doing every day, then we're not going to be thinking dynamic risk assessments in that environment. The management of health and safety at work regulations. Is it going to mention dynamic risk assessments in here? It's not going to mention dynamic risk assessment in here either. But it's going to say every employer shall make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks. This is all pre-event. It's not post-event. It's not during the time. But if we do look at Regulation 13, capabilities and training, every employer shall ensure an entrusting task to his employees, they take into account their capabilities as regards to health and safety. Every employer shall ensure that his employees are provided with adequate health and safety training on their being recruited, on their being exposed to new or increased risks. So again, if you're doing dynamic risk assessments, training. That's the only way you're going to evidence to the regulator, but that's the only way you're going to do what's right. People need that training. Let's look at the NFCC. Let's have a look again. Fire safety, sort of fire operations, for want of a better word. Let's have a look through your control measures. Control measures, risk assessment at an incident. Are we going to get? We've got safe systems at work, and then we have dynamic risk assessment. The fire service know more than most people that when they get there, that's going to be dynamic. If you've been in the military, it's going to be dynamic. If you're doing private security, it's dynamic at the time. So dynamic risk assessment describes the assessment of risk in a rapidly changing environment at an incident where decisions are sometimes made in a fast-moving situations. So yes, dynamic risk assessments do get talked about. We haven't seen it there in the regulations. If we look at then, if we just jump across, go on the internet, and we just typed in dynamic risk assessments, we got the University of Manchester, the role of generic and dynamic risk assessments. Yeah, so companies, organisations are putting them into place. If we look at JSP 375, if we look at the military, the UK military, we're talking about risk assessment here again. I'm not showing you anything I shouldn't be. This is all available online. But if we go through until we come down to roles and responsibilities, it's a very good document actually, worth looking at. Risk assessors, but we keep on coming down until we come down to risk assessment. Should consider all foreseeable hazards, but we know not everything is foreseeable. So do they include dynamic risk assessments in here? Yes, they do. Just going to find it. This is normal risk assessment. Retention of records, but now we have, when we come down to the flow chart, we have a mention of dynamic risk assessments. Evaluate the task and identify all associated hazards. Trivial safety consequences or impossible circumstances should not be subject to risk assessment. Great advice. Then we're going to identify the more suitable type of assessment. This is where I think this really helps because it splits it down. Moving from right to left, generic or model risk assessments. The HSE say themselves in some guidance. They're acceptable, but it needs to be narrowed down at the appropriate time. Task activity or person-specific risk assessments, and then we're talking about dynamic risk assessment. What I really like about this document is, although it says here that these two are recorded, even with the dynamic risk assessment, when we move through the flow and when we further read about it, or it's further up in the document, it actually tells us after the event that we should go back and document that dynamic risk assessment, because we've now potentially got a new proven route. Yeah, we've been a certain way, we've done our patrol report, and in this situation, it is recording that dynamic risk assessment that was undertaken. L21. Now this is the old approved code of practice for the management of health and safety work regulations. It's not available anymore. You can find it on the internet. There used to be an ACOP and now it's not. But if we put dynamic in and we go through that, we're not going to find the term dynamic. If we go into HSG 268, the health and safety toolbox, are we going to find dynamic? No, we're not. If we go into INDG 163, which is the risk assessment in the workplace, it used to be the 5 steps, then are we going to find dynamic? No, we're not. If we go into RR 151, very good document, good practice and risk assessment pitfalls. An old document, 66 pages, really is worth reading through though. But if you go through this, are you going to find dynamic? No, you're not. But you are going to find a lot of good information on what makes a good risk assessment. We've got risk assessment terminology. Bear in mind, this is hazard risk. This is not opportunity risk. This is not control risk, and it's not compliance risks as such. This is hazard risks. And it gives a lot of good information. So have a look for this document, RR 151. Are we going to find dynamic in there? No, we're not. But it's worth looking at. Interestingly, I've been reviewing and following the Manchester Arena inquiry, which is it's unbelievable. But there's nothing more dynamic than that situation. So we have a suicide bomber. If you're into security or safety, it's worth looking at the inquiry. You can see it online. But also, what I do is, if you also put Manchester Arena inquiry and look at the arena attack on the BBC News, it gives you a blow-by-blow, day-by-day, the output of the actual inquiry. So there's a couple of things worthy of note within here. Bomb attack stewards not trained properly. Well, this is this gentleman saying this. He's a security expert, as what it states in here. He's saying that the stewards were hardly briefed. So let's go back to that written risk assessment. And now think about the dynamic risk assessment at that time. They talk in here about the inability to sort of profile and see behaviour, they talk about in here. So if you're relying on dynamic risk assessments, these things have to be taken into consideration. Not enough staff to profile the crowd before attack. Again, we can link this to dynamic risk assessment and the all-important training. 1 second. The police arena emergency plan was 1 year out of date. Again, I'm not here to pick holes in that, but ultimately it's a year out of date. Excuse me. Does that tell us? What does it tell us? Well, certainly what's coming out from this is that people are busy. They're too busy. So if you're too busy to do that, we're too busy potentially to do training. And I think we've got one more in here. Concerns over terror assessment before the bombing. So in this one, the head of security felt that the arena risk assessments were not extensive enough. A comment he makes is that it's on the new template. So we're now talking about the template, and the head of security is saying that for a start, he doesn't think the risk assessment were extensive enough. But what he also says is the template, and this, I often go on about templates. It's easy to become snowblind. If you're reading a template from left to right, you're potentially going to follow the template. Templates are very, very important, but we need the right template in the right hands. As William Edwards Deming says, it's not good enough to do your best. You have to know what you're doing and then do your best. That is so important with risk assessment templates. Let's step out of the template. Let's go back to the risk assessment methodology. If the methodology is that you're relying on point of work risk assessments and dynamic risk assessments, then they require training, of course. Have a read through this. Bomber's hiding spot not patrolled by security. So now let's look at the written risk assessment now. So the written risk assessment, did it dictate whereby these patrols should have been done? But what about the dynamic risk assessment? Risk assessing, if you're a security practitioner, trained, then ultimately if you believe there's areas that aren't getting patrolled, you may be flagging that up. I can't comment on why people don't flag it up, but that's what we're talking about, dynamic risk assessment. If a company is going to rely on dynamic risk assessments, then you've got to rely on the people that you've got being trained and having the attributes and attitude towards it to be able to carry it out. This document I find interesting. Why? Because it's a course that I went on. I think it's a fantastic course. It was the HSE Inspectors Guide to Risk Assessment course. I wanted to go on this course just to get a gut check on my knowledge, the years that I've been doing this. But hang on, let's get it from a HSE inspector. Fantastic course. Cost about £550, but it was worth it. It was my CPD for last year. So the HSE's Inspector's Guide to Risk Assessment. What might that tell us? Interestingly, handout 9, how to improve your risk assessment process. Let's have a quick look here. It talks about INDG 163 that we sort of just mentioned. What I want to get down to is arrangements. Provide suitable tools. So in your arrangements, make it clear who is responsible for approving risk assessments, who is responsible for your risk assessment methodology. Provide suitable tools. So we have risk assessment forms, model or generic risk assessment, but here it is, guidance example on using generic and dynamic risk assessments. Interestingly, it mentions that matrices, sometimes we shouldn't be relying on them. I think a lot of us know that. Let's go on to the final page of this, where it goes in a little bit more depth. Okay, point of work. Dynamic risk assessments are essential for emergency services, as we've just discussed, and are also useful for some other peripatetic workers. These are workers who are out about on the ground, whose workplaces cannot be assessed in advance. However, this is the caveat. They rely heavily on the competence of the individuals involved and can bring other problems. So they do need additional controls, such as higher levels of training, regular refresher training, toolbox talks, etc. Different types of supervision, access to immediate advice, on-site assessment tools. So dynamic risk assessments. It's mentioned within this document. I thought it was a great course. And really we've sort of looked through the legislation. We haven't found it. We've looked at a couple of instances where dynamic risk assessments would have been used. And now we've got it from the HSE inspector's mouth. It says within this training that it's not law, it's just guidance. It's a guide. But that really does sum it up for me there, that point of work risk assessments require higher levels of training. So that's it. Quite a long video, but it's very, very important. D is for dynamic risk assessment.
So that's it. It's simple really. The knowledge we have and the decisions we make really can keep people safe. Today's letter was D, and the subject was dynamic risk assessment, not dugong. Dugongs are cousins of manatees and they share a similar plump appearance but have a dolphin flu-like tail. Thanks for watching.